Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the darkest corners of medieval history. The twisted corridors where power met cruelty and rulers carved their names into legend with blood, not ink. Picture this: a misty Transylvanian landscape under moonlight, a looming castle perched high above a valley, and below it a field, but not of crops, of bodies. Upright, rigid, grotesquely arranged like some nightmarish sculpture garden. And in the center of it all, Vlad, watching. You've just wandered into the brutal world of Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad III or Vlad Dracula, and you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Always love knowing how global this sleepy little campfire has become. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the thick pine forests of 15th century Wallachia, boots sinking into half-frozen mud. The scent of smoke and something vaguely metallic clings to the air. And just ahead, there's that unmistakable sound, wood creaking under the weight of something heavy swaying. Then you see it. Rows of impaled bodies, some freshly mounted, others long decayed. A silent army of the dead lining the roads. Travelers turn back, armies retreat. Even hardened Ottoman generals flinch. This is Vlad's signature, terror as a military tactic. Born in 1431, ironically in the Transylvanian city of Siasora, Vlad was the son of Vlad II Dracul, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric group formed to defend Christendom. Hence the Dracula name, Son of the Dragon. Cute, right? Except little Vlad wasn't exactly raised on bedtime stories and apple pies. At a young age, he and his brother Radu were handed over to the Ottoman Empire as political hostages, a medieval will-behave promise, insurance policy. He grew up around violence, suspicion, and betrayal. And when he finally returned to claim Wallachia's throne, he brought all that trauma back with him, neatly sharpened. Vlad's reign, especially his 1456-1462 stint, was marked by a love affair with impalement. He didn't invent the method, but he certainly made it famous. The trick, apparently, was to insert the stake carefully so it missed vital organs. Victims could last hours or days. Vlad was a man of detail. Historians estimate tens of thousands of people met their end this way: criminals, traitors, invading soldiers, and sometimes just folks who annoyed him. Legend tells of one banquet where he invited his political rivals, got them drunk, and then had them all stabbed and impaled before dessert. Sleep well tonight. But Vlad wasn't just a bloodthirsty maniac with a spear fetish. That's where it gets complicated. See, the region of Wallachia was constantly threatened by the Hungarians, by rival noble families, and most of all by the mighty Ottoman Empire. Vlad used fear as a weapon. He wasn't just killing for fun, though. The line's blurry. He was building a reputation. One story describes how Sultan Mehmed II turned around and left after seeing a forest of 20,000 impaled soldiers outside Targovist. No battle, no bloodshed, just vibes. You have to admire the efficiency. Of course, Western Europe, especially German pamphlets, painted Vlad as a total monster. They wrote about him boiling people alive, feeding children to their mothers, even nailing hats to heads for disrespecting etiquette. Some of these stories were pure propaganda, others verified by multiple sources. Historians still argue whether the worst tales were exaggerated, but even the baseline truth is enough to make your toes curl under the blanket. Here's the fringe fact. One local legend insists Vlad once dipped his bread in the blood of his victims. Very Dracula-core. But whether that's literal or symbolic, well, that's where the lines between horror and history get smudged. And speaking of Dracula, yes, Bram Stoker took inspiration from Vlad, though he never visited Romania and likely based much of the vampire lore on 19th century Transylvanian myths and vibes. Still, the name stuck. And Vlad's legacy became eternal, if also deeply misunderstood. He wasn't undead, just really, really unpleasant. Yet in Romania today, he's not universally hated. Some even revere him as a national hero. Why? Because he stood up to invaders, because he enforced justice, even if brutally, and because, in a landscape of cowardly rulers and corrupt nobles, Vlad never backed down. He made order out of chaos, albeit with enough spikes to make a porcupine nervous. So now, as you stand at the edge of that ghostly forest of impaled corpses, the full moon bathing everything in bone-white light, you realize you're not just looking at death, you're looking at control, psychological warfare in its rawest form, and somehow that makes it worse. Because it worked. You're still shivering from that last stop in Wallachia when the scene shifts. The air gets drier, warmer, but not in a cozy way. It's the kind of dry heat that clings to chainmail and scorches the edges of parchment maps. You're in southern France now, Languedoc to be precise. Year 1209. The sky is cobalt blue, but the town beneath it is trembling. Welcome to Béziers. And welcome to Simon de Montfort, the original poster child for the phrase zero chill. A nobleman, crusader, and a man who believed with unshakable conviction that divine orders justified anything, including genocide. You step through the chaos of a siege in progress. Smoke rises from shattered gates. The air smells of sweat, iron, and scorched flour. Villagers scream, soldiers roar, horses shriek. And somewhere in that storm of destruction stands Simon, pristine in white, bearing the papal seal and swinging a blade with holy fury. This wasn't just any war. This was the Albigensian Crusade, launched by the Catholic Church against the Cathars, a religious group considered heretical because, well, they had some unusual ideas, like believing the material world was evil and not recognizing papal authority, which, as you can imagine, didn't win them many fans in Rome. Pope Innocent III declared the Cathars a threat to Christianity itself, and Simon answered the call with glee. Not a bishop, not a monk, a warlord with a sword and a loophole in morality. Now picture this. Béziers, a Cathar stronghold town, refuses to hand over its heretics. Simon isn't amused. His army breaches the walls, and one of his underlings supposedly asks, "How do we tell the Cathars from the Catholics?" And Simon, without skipping a beat, allegedly replies, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Now historians still argue whether he actually said that. It's one of those quotes that might be apocryphal, a little too perfectly cruel. But whether or not it was spoken aloud, the massacre happened. Men, women, children slaughtered wholesale. Churches weren't spared, nor were the priests inside them. Estimates vary, but some sources claim up to 20,000 people were killed that day. Think about that. A whole population erased, and all in the name of religious purity. And Simon, he was rewarded. The Pope appointed him the leader of the crusade, and later he was granted land and titles in the very regions he'd helped depopulate. Practical, if horrifying, like a medieval version of Finders Keepers, but with significantly more blood. Here's a quirky side note that makes this all even more disturbing. Simon was considered deeply pious. He prayed constantly, fasted often, and reportedly wept at Mass. People described him as humble, except when he was committing genocide. It's almost like he filed his conscience separately from his sword hand. After Béziers, Simon kept marching. Town after town fell: Carcassonne, Minerve, Lavore. In one instance, over 140 Cathars were burned alive, after being promised safe passage if they converted. Spoiler, they didn't convert and the bonfires went up anyway. You might be wondering what it felt like to be near Simon. Imagine a man who speaks softly but gives orders that cause cities to vanish. He wasn't a raving lunatic. He was calm, deliberate, a spreadsheet mind operating in a world of flesh. No screaming fits, no unhinged proclamations, just faith-backed brutality. And his cruelty wasn't just military, it was administrative. When towns surrendered, he often forced residents to wear yellow crosses stitched onto their clothes to mark them as former heretics. Public shamming, medieval style. And if they slipped up, say, went to the wrong church or missed confession, back to the fire. Simon's reign of terror didn't last forever. In 1218, during the siege of Toulouse, he caught a catapult stone to the head. Just bonk, gone. Some say it was launched by a group of women defending their city, a tiny poetic footnote to a chapter drenched in agony. But even in death, his legacy festered. His son tried to continue his work, and the land he cleared by fire and sword was absorbed into the French crown. The Cathar movement was crushed, their castles razed, their books burned, their names for the most part forgotten. And here's the part that sticks in your throat like dry ash. To this day, some see Simon as a defender of the faith. Statues have been raised, songs sung, and while his official sainthood never materialized, too much baggage, even for the Vatican, his story is still told in churches. Which brings us back to that quiet question echoing down the centuries. Was Simon de Montfort just a man of his time, a devout crusader obeying orders? Or was he something darker, someone who used God as an alibi for cruelty? Historians still argue whether his actions were driven by fanaticism, ambition, or cold opportunism. Maybe it was all three. Maybe the line between righteousness and ruthlessness is thinner than we'd like to think. You stand now in the ruins of Béziers, the sun dipping low over ancient stones. There's barely a whisper of the lives that once bustled here. But if you listen closely, past the birdsong and cicadas, past the wind in broken arches, you might still hear it, the echo of a sword being drawn in God's name. You blink and the dusty ruins of Béziers dissolve into a cobbled cityscape. You're in Paris now, though not the romantic one with pastries and jazz cafes. This is the 14th century, and the scent in the air is less croissant, more coagulated blood. There's a crowd gathering near the place to grieve. Children peek between wool-clad legs, vendors pause mid-sale, and even stray dogs sense something thrilling is about to unfold. You push your way closer, and that's when you see him. Geoffroy Theurge, Paris's most infamous executioner, and possibly the only man who ever smiled while disemboweling someone in front of a cheering crowd. He stands tall in a red tunic, sharpening his gleaming blade with theatrical slowness. His eyes twinkle. He nods to the crowd like a magician about to pull a rabbit from a hat. Only in this case, the hat is someone's abdomen, and the rabbit, regret. Geoffroy wasn't born into cruelty. Executioners rarely were. But once in the role, he leaned in hard. And here's the twist. In medieval France, the job of executioner was a bit of a paradox. Essential, but socially cursed. Most people wouldn't even touch them in the marketplace. You could be elbow-deep in royal justice by day and totally ghosted at the tavern by night. Still, Geoffroy made the most of it. He turned public executions into grand theater. Gallows? Check. Audience? Check. A flair for timing and crowd-pleasing? Absolutely. His most famous performance was the execution of Joan of Arc in 1431. Yes, that Joan, the teenage peasant girl who led French armies and heard voices from saints. Geoffroy was the man who oversaw her burning at the stake. Now here's where it gets complicated. He didn't actually light the fire himself. That task fell to municipal workers, but he was responsible for the overall staging. And let's just say the medieval crowd didn't get refunds for poor packing. Joan's execution was dragged out, messy and horrifying. According to some accounts, he later confessed and wept, overcome by guilt. Others say he pocketed a bonus and went out for wine. Historians still argue whether he truly repented, or was just covering his back when the political winds shifted. But the fact remains, he was there, and his presence is burned into the story forever. Outside of Joan's trial, Geoffroy made a career of spectacle. One time, he reportedly executed dozens of criminals in a single day, changing techniques like a chef experimenting with new recipes. Hanging, burning, breaking on the wheel, you name it, Jeffrey had a favorite version. There's a niche rumor that he used to whistle while he worked, like some kind of grisly snow-white dwarf with an axe. And because you're probably wondering, yes, executioners got paid well, sometimes better than mayors or judges. Per-kill rates varied and bonuses were awarded for difficult cases like nobility or botched attempts that needed repeating. Fringe fact, they often got the clothing of the condemned. So Jeffrey probably had a closet full of very expensive, very unlucky tunics. Now imagine the scene again. The crowd at Place de Grève cheers as he hoists a head aloft. Blood drips down his sleeve. The condemned's body twitches for the last time. And Jeffrey, he bows, not out of respect but as if finishing a monologue. The man knew how to stick a landing. Yet it's not all guts and glory. Executioners lived on society's edge. They couldn't marry freely and their children were often shunned. Some towns even required them to live just outside the walls. The job was hereditary in many cases, passed down like a cursed heirloom. In fact, Jeffrey's son later took over the role, though records suggest he lacked his father's charm. And here's a chilling thought: Jeffrey liked his job. He wasn't just some reluctant civil servant. He was proud of his precision, thoughtful about the tools he used. He once allegedly bragged that he could decapitate a man with a single, clean stroke, no mess, no delay. The crowd appreciated that. So did the condemned, probably. Of course, by modern standards, it's horrifying. But back then, it was entertainment, justice, and spiritual cleansing all rolled into one bloody afternoon. People believed that watching executions could deter sin, that it was good for the soul. Jeffrey didn't just kill bodies, he, in their minds, helped save communities. Still, you can't help but wonder, was it all just a job for him, or did he enjoy it too much? Historians still argue whether executioners like Jeffrey were desensitized over time, or if certain types of personalities gravitated toward the role. And let's be honest, you don't end up becoming a national celebrity for your excellent knot tying unless you've got something extra under the hood. As night falls over the square, the crowd finally disperses. Jeffrey packs up his blades with meticulous care, and you watch him vanish down a narrow alley, whistling. You'll never look at a sharp knife quite the same way again. You're still hearing that eerie whistle echoing behind you as the streets of Paris dissolve into wind-blown dunes and ruined battlements. Dust coats your tongue. Ash stings your eyes. You're no longer in Europe. Welcome to 13th century Baghdad, or what's left of it. Ahead stands a man on horseback, robed in embroidered silk, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. His name? Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brother to Kublai, a Mongol prince who brought with him not just conquest, but calculated devastation. He doesn't yell, he doesn't posture. Hulagu lets the fire and screams do the talking. It's 1258 and you've stumbled right into the most infamous sacking in medieval Islamic history. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a cultural and intellectual jewel, is about to be wiped off the map like ink from parchment. And Hulagu, he's the one holding the sponge. He arrives with a force so massive it looks like a tide of metal on horseback. The Mongol army is famous for being fast, strategic, and horrifyingly effective. But Hulagu, he takes it a step further. He sends envoys to the Caliph al-Musta'sim, politely suggesting surrender. The Caliph, trusting in his city's prestige and divine favor, declines. Bold move, unwise. Hulagu proceeds to lay siege with clinical precision. Siege engines are rolled forward. River defenses are rerouted. Bridges are destroyed. The Tigris becomes a battlefield. After about 2 weeks, the city walls are breached, and what follows makes even other Mongol campaigns look restrained. Baghdad is systematically destroyed. Libraries are torched. The famed House of Wisdom, which held priceless ancient texts in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, gone. Legend says the Tigris ran black with ink from the books dumped into it, and then red from the people who followed. It's said that over 200,000 people were killed. Some chronicles push that figure toward 1 million, though historians still argue about the accuracy of the count. What no one argues is that Baghdad never recovered its former glory. It went from the crown of the Muslim world to a crater. And the cruelty didn't end there. Hulagu captures the caliph himself, wraps him in a carpet, and because Mongols considered royal blood too sacred to spill, has him trampled to death by horses. A technicality, really, and a metaphor if you're feeling poetic. Fringe tidbit. Some sources claim Hulagu's astrologers advised him not to shed the caliph's blood directly, fearing divine wrath. So, horse blanket death it was. Nothing like mysticism mixed with logistics. Now here's the twist. Hulagu wasn't just a destroyer. He was also a builder in his own scorched earth kind of way. After flattening cities, he often installed Mongol-style administration, trade routes, and tax systems. He even built a capital in Maragha, Iran, and funded observatories and hospitals there. Like a landlord who tears down your house but offers you a voucher for a new one in another country. And he had his contradictions. For example, despite being raised Buddhist, he had a Christian wife, Dakwaz Khatan, who reportedly influenced his policy toward Christians in conquered territories. Some churches were spared thanks to her intervention. So if you were a Christian in Baghdad, your odds of survival may have been slightly higher than your neighbors. But don't mistake that for mercy. It was strategy. Because here's the thing about Hulagu, his cruelty was never emotional. No fits of rage, no wild speeches. His violence was methodical, almost bureaucratic. He was like an accountant of annihilation, balancing ledgers in lives lost and empires broken. Historians still debate whether Hulagu had deeper motives beyond conquest. Was he trying to carve a legacy distinct from Genghis and Kublai? Was he drunk on power, or simply following orders from the Great Khan? Or did he genuinely believe that erasing centers of resistance, completely, was the only path to lasting peace? There's no clear answer, just smoldering ruins. You walk now through the shattered remnants of the Abbasid palace. A marble column leans drunkenly to one side. Somewhere under your feet lie the foundations of centuries-old poetry, astronomy, medicine, gone in a blink. And for what? A warning. That's what Hulagu left behind. Not just to Baghdad, but to the world. Cross the Mongols and your city ceases to exist. Simple as that. And as you glance up at the gray sky, a hawk circles overhead. Hulagu's banner flaps quietly in the breeze. No laughter, no cheers, just the wind blowing through a graveyard that used to be a civilization. Sleep tight. You barely have time to wipe the ash from your boots when the air shifts again, this time colder. Not icy exactly, but brittle like glass. You're in late 14th century France, under the gray skis of Paris again, but this isn't about executioners or crusades. This is about a king, a man in a crown who thinks he's made of glass. Meet Charles VI, also known as Charles the Mad. But the madness isn't even the scariest part. It's what happens when power and delusion intertwine. When a man with absolute control starts believing his enemies can shatter him with a bump of the elbow. You wander through the darkened halls of the royal palace. Torches flicker, courtiers whisper behind velvet sleeves, and somewhere inside a heavily guarded chamber, Charles paces, his crown askew, his eyes glassy, literally and figuratively. He's convinced his body is fragile, that a fall, a stumble, a touch could cause him to break into shards. So he wears reinforced clothing, lined with iron rods and thick cloth to protect his glassy limbs. He bans anyone from approaching too quickly. He lashes out, sometimes literally, if he feels threatened. And no, this isn't a metaphor. This is an actual psychological condition, known today as the glass delusion. And yes, it was historically documented in more than one noble. But Charles takes it further. Earlier in his reign, he'd seemed promising. Crowned king in 1380 at just 11, Charles inherited a France riddled with problems, war with England, powerful nobles jockeying for control, and the Black Death still fresh in everyone's memory. As a teen, he even showed signs of leadership. He formed a council, tried to bring stability, and reportedly loved tournaments and dancing. Then in 1392, something snapped. While traveling through the forest of Le Mans, Charles, unprovoked, suddenly drew his sword and attacked his own men, killed several. He had to be restrained, foaming at the mouth, raving about betrayal and fire. Afterward, he didn't remember it, just blankness. That was the beginning of his decline into madness, which would dominate the rest of his life and ruin the lives of others along the way. His reign turned into a pendulum swing between lucidity and psychosis. When lucid, he was quiet, even affectionate. When not, well, that's when things got medieval. Here's the thing, Charles wasn't evil in the way Vlad or Hulagu were. His cruelty didn't come from malice. It came from paranoia, from a broken mind ruling over a very unbroken kingdom. And the people around him, they weaponized that madness like a puppet with knives. You remember the Bal des Ardents? No, that's okay, let's ruin a ball together. In 1393, during a lavish masquerade ball to celebrate a royal wedding, Charles and a few noblemen dressed up as wild men, essentially hairy forest creatures. They wore costumes made of linen soaked in wax and pitch. Fun. Someone brought a torch too close. One man lit up like a candle, then another. Charles was saved, barely, by the Duchess of Berry, who threw her skirts over him. The others weren't so lucky. The scene turned into a bonfire of screaming nobility. 4 men died in agony. Charles watched, silent, maybe understanding, maybe not. And still, the throne remained his. That's where things get dangerous. When the king loses his mind, someone always rushes to fill the vacuum. Enter his uncles, especially Philip the Bold and Louis of Orleans. And later, a man named John the Fearless. Power struggles erupted like wildfire. France became a board game of blood. Factions used Charles's name to legitimize their wars, signing documents in his name, making decisions while he raved in a corner about being glass. Fringe tidbit: during some of his delusional episodes, Charles forgot he was king. Literally. He asked people who he was, why they were bowing. Sometimes he forgot his own children. Sometimes he mistook servants for enemies and tried to kill them. One time he believed he was St. George. A lot of kings wore masks. Charles just lost track of which one was real. And yet through it all, France stumbled forward. His wife Isabeau of Bavaria took over some duties. His son, the future Charles VII, waited. But the country was spiraling into chaos. The English saw an opening. Civil war simmered between Armagnacs and Burgundians. The 100 Years' War entered a new, vicious phase. And Charles, still shuffling down palace halls, his robe padded against invisible cracks. The king who lived in a bubble, not metaphorically, but one he believed was literally his body. Historians still argue whether Charles's illness was hereditary, possibly linked to schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or even triggered by encephalitis or mercury poisoning. There are no clear answers, just fragments, like broken glass, of a ruler who couldn't quite hold together. You watch him now, shivering beside a candelabra, whispering Latin prayers into the corner of a cold stone wall. His courtiers stand at a distance, silent, wary. No one knows which version of the king they'll get today. And neither does he. You leave the dim corridors of the French palace behind, but that whisper of madness trails you like smoke. Now you're somewhere colder still. Windswept stone walls rise around you, thick with moss and shadow. It smells of old wood, wet fur, and conspiracy. Welcome to 14th century England. Tonight, you're visiting a queen with a dagger tucked beneath her velvet cloak. Her name, Isabella of France, but history remembers her as the she-wolf of France. And she doesn't just have a reputation, she's got a body count. Born into French royalty and married off to Edward II of England, Isabella had the makings of a typical medieval queen: diplomatic pawn, occasional peacemaker, endlessly sidelined. But Isabella didn't stay sidelined. Not after her husband began spending more time with his favorites than with her, especially a man named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wasn't just a close friend to Edward. He was everything Isabella wasn't: a companion, a confidant, and possibly more. Edward showered him with titles and wealth while ignoring Isabella at court. She wasn't even given basic provisions for her household. Imagine being queen and still needing to ask permission to buy socks. But the real turning point came later, when Gaveston was executed by jealous nobles, and a new favorite took his place: Hugh Despenser the Younger. Oh, Hugh, a man so wildly unpopular, even medieval chroniclers couldn't hide their disgust. He wasn't just Edward's confidant, he effectively ruled through manipulation, torture, and land theft. Entire noble families were ruined. People were imprisoned for refusing his schemes. And Isabella, she was humiliated, stripped of lands, her children held like bargaining chips. So she smiled, curtsied, and waited. In 1325, Isabella went on a diplomatic mission to France and didn't come back. She stayed in Paris, reunited with her brother King Charles IV, and struck up a strategic and scandalous alliance with Roger Mortimer, an English noble exiled for treason. He was charismatic, powerful, and allegedly her lover. Together they plotted. And in 1326, they returned to England with a mercenary army, Isabella's teenage son Edward, the future Edward III, and a whole lot of revenge. Edward II and Hugh Despenser were caught trying to flee. Isabella's army hunted them down like foxes. Hugh was executed brutally, so brutally that even by medieval standards people gasped. Here's your quirky tidbit: Hugh Despenser's execution was performed with all the subtlety of a Game of Thrones episode. He was hanged, eviscerated while alive, and his body was quartered. Some say Isabella watched, others say she arranged the spectacle as a message. Regardless, Hugh was quite literally scattered to the four winds. And Edward II, that's where things get murky. He was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle and months later declared dead. The official line: natural causes. But of course, history loves a juicy alternative. One persistent story claims he was murdered with a red-hot poker inserted where no poker should go. The idea being, no visible wounds, just internal fireworks. Historians still argue whether that's fact, folklore, or poetic political revenge. Many modern scholars think it's exaggerated, perhaps invented by later writers to make Isabella look monstrous. But it's stuck. And here, where the story takes a sharp turn. After their victory, Isabella and Mortimer took control of the English government. Her son Edward was too young to rule, so she served as regent. At first, people were relieved. Finally, the tyrants were gone. Surely things would calm down now. They did not calm down. Mortimer began acting like a king in all but name. The court grew corrupt, full of backdoor deals and flashy spending. Isabella went from queen consort to puppet master, making foreign policy decisions, seizing castles, and wearing the crown a little too comfortably. And her son noticed. By 1330, young Edward III was ready. He staged a coup, secretly sneaking into Nottingham Castle and arresting Mortimer in the dead of night. Isabella was spared execution, but Mortimer, hanged for treason, just like the enemies they'd toppled years before. Isabella was placed under house arrest, not tortured, not banished, just quietly moved to Castle Rising with a generous allowance and a staff of her own. She lived out her life in relative peace, embroidering, praying, and possibly reflecting on the heads she helped roll. Historians still argue whether Isabella was a cruel villain or a woman pushed to extremes. Some paint her as cold and power-hungry, a traitor to her king, her country, and her crown. Others see her as a survivor, navigating a world that left women with few weapons except manipulation and marriage. Maybe she wasn't a she-wolf. maybe she just learned to bite back. But tonight, as you sit on the edge of her shadowed chamber, the candlelight flickers against stone walls, and you hear her voice whisper through history. They made me a pawn. I became a queen. And maybe that's true, but pawns don't usually leave bloodstains on the board. A salty wind cuts across your face now, and the world shifts again, rougher, harsher. Gone are the velvet halls and whispered plots. Instead, there's the clink of mail armor, the roar of waves smashing rocky coasts, and the heavy scent of pine smoke mixed with blood. You're in 10th century Scandinavia now, Norway to be specific, and the name in the wind, shouted from hilltops and cursed in whispers, is Eric Bloodaxe. Yes, that's his real name, and no, it wasn't ironic. You trudge through wet moss and up toward a longhouse perched on a bluff. The sky overhead is moody, roiling with storm clouds. Inside, the feast is loud, wild. Mead sloshes, bones crack, and seated at the head of the table is a man whose face is half shadow, half smirk. Eric. His eyes glitter the way only a man's do when he has both the crown of Norway and a very personal relationship with his axe. Eric Bloodaxe was the son of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first recognized king, which sounds noble until you realize Harald had more than 20 sons. And Eric, well, let's just say he took sibling rivalry to a new level. One by one, his brothers mysteriously, or not so mysteriously, died. Some were cut down in battle, some were assassinated, and at least one was killed by Eric himself. Not a lot of cozy family dinners. The name Bloodaxe was earned, not inherited, and it wasn't just about war, it was about reputation. In the Viking world, fear mattered. If people thought you were cruel, unpredictable, and likely to gut them over a late tribute, well, they tended to pay up on time. And Eric leaned into it. He ruled Norway briefly after his father's death, but it didn't last. The nobles hated him, too violent, too impulsive, and not great at keeping the peace. Eventually, they backed one of his surviving brothers. Yes, some were left, and Eric was forced to flee. Where to? Northumbria, modern-day England. Because, of course, when you get kicked out of one kingdom, you try your luck in another. He actually became king of Northumbria twice. In the wild game of Anglo-Saxon thrones, Eric was a wild card. He fought, he schemed, he ruled, and then he got booted, then fought back, then died. Spoiler alert. Now let's talk cruelty. Eric didn't conquer lands, he cleansed them. Villages that resisted his authority were reportedly burned. Dissenting chieftains were publicly executed. Enemies were blood-eagled, a ritual where the ribs are split from the spine and lungs pulled out to form wings. Whether this practice actually happened or is just Viking PR, historians still argue, but Eric's name is the one most associated with it. Fringe fact: some sagas claim Eric had his wife, Gunhild, join him in political purges. She was known as Mother of Kings, and if you believe Norse poetry, had a habit of charming, poisoning, or hexing people into oblivion. Whether that's literal or poetic, probably both. Eric's second reign in Northumbria ended about as well as a Norse saga ever does, with betrayal. In 954, he was ambushed and killed at the Battle of Stainmore. His head was sent to King Edred of England as a very aggressive thank you note. But even in death, Eric couldn't be erased. His legend became bigger than his legacy. Songs were sung, sagas written. Some even claimed he entered Valhalla, chosen by the gods not for kindness but for sheer unrelenting ferocity. He wasn't a lawgiver, he wasn't a builder. He was a storm in human form, brief, destructive, and impossible to ignore. And the thing is, he wasn't alone in his brutality. Viking society valued strength and vengeance over mercy. But Eric took that culture and turned it into theater. He knew how to make an example out of people. He didn't just kill traitors, he carved their names into history using blood. And there's a certain cold efficiency in that. He didn't waste words, didn't draw up endless scrolls of rules. You crossed Eric and he made sure the ravens had something to talk about. Today, historians still debate whether Eric was exceptionally cruel or just exceptionally successful at being remembered. In a sea of warlords, he's the one whose name survives not just in dusty archives, but on mugs, metal albums, and video games. You step now out onto the cliffs of Northumbria. The wind howls, and if you listen hard, you might hear the clash of blades and the scream of longboats in the distance. Or maybe it's just the ghost of Eric Bloodaxe, sharpening his axe in Valhalla, waiting for the next traitor to step too close. Sleep well, and maybe double-check who your siblings are before visiting the family reunion. From the icy fjords of Eric's world, you're suddenly cloaked in heavy incense and echoing chants. The light is low, filtered through thick cathedral windows and caught in the smoke curling from brass censers. You've entered a place of worship, or at least, a place that claims to be, but you don't feel comforted. You feel trapped. Because tonight, you're sitting across from Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, and a man who somehow turned confession into the most dangerous word in the Castilian language. You can hear it now, confess, and your soul will be saved. Only you know what's coming: the rope, the rack, the smell of burnt parchment and singed hair, maybe even the Iron Maiden, though historians still debate whether that one was just legend. Still, if anyone would have greenlit it, it would have been Tomás. Born around 1420, Torquemada was a Dominican friar. At first glance, he was exactly what you'd expect from a man of the cloth: pious, rigid, seemingly incorruptible. But peel back the habit and you'll find a soul more obsessed with purity than mercy, more focused on rooting out perceived infection than healing it. Torquemada didn't invent the Inquisition, but he perfected it. In 1478, Spain's monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, launched the Spanish Inquisition to reinforce Catholic orthodoxy, especially among conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure. And who did they tap to run this theological iron fist? Tomás, because, apparently, Satan took a vacation and needed a stand-in. By 1483, he had absolute power over the Inquisition's procedures. He established tribunals across Spain, created spy networks, and standardized torture techniques so efficiently you'd think he was designing a business franchise. One mainstream historical fact: during his tenure, more than 2,000 people were burned at the stake. Thousands more were imprisoned, fined, exiled, or forced to wear the humiliating San Benito, a yellow penitential tunic with symbols of flame and devils, just to make sure your neighbors knew you, confessed. And yet, Tomás insisted he wasn't cruel. In fact, in his twisted view, he was being merciful, saving souls, pulling weeds from the Garden of Christendom. The goal, he claimed, wasn't punishment, it was purification. You know, like how bleach purifies bacteria. And here's your fringe fact: he kept a list of suspects locked in a chest that reportedly included royal advisors, noblemen, even queen's attendants. No one was safe. Once your name landed in Torquemada's book, you either ran or prayed really, really hard. He used psychological pressure as well as physical. Trials were held in secret. Accusers remained anonymous. Defendants often had no idea what they were being charged with. But that didn't stop the torture. Stretching on the rack. Waterboarding, yes, even back then. The strapado, where victims were hoisted by their arms and then dropped, dislocating joints and shattering shoulders. And yet, when he walked through the cloisters, head bowed in apparent humility, people kissed his robes. Why? Because fear works, especially when it comes dressed as righteousness. Torquemada even censored books, helping create an early version of the Index of Forbidden Texts. If it sounded too Jewish, too Islamic, too philosophical, or just too interesting, it burned. Much like the people he deemed unfit to live within the purified Christian state. Now you may be wondering, how did the monarchy feel about all this? At first, they loved it. Ferdinand and Isabella used Torquemada's reputation to centralize power, eliminate opposition, and consolidate their rule. He wasn't just a religious figure, he was a political weapon. But even monarchs can feel a chill. Rumors suggest that foreign diplomats begged the king to tone Tamaz down. Even Pope Innocent VIII was uneasy. Letters were written, warnings made, but Tamaz, unmoved. He kept going until his health declined in the late 1490s. He died in 1498, likely in his monastery at Avila, surrounded by stone walls and silence. He had lived long enough to witness the expulsion of all practicing Jews from Spain in 1492, a decree he personally pushed for. Historians still argue whether Torquemada truly believed in what he was doing, or whether he used faith to disguise a more pathological hunger for control. Was it fanaticism, or sadism in holy robes? Maybe both. Maybe that's what makes him so disturbing. Because Torquemada wasn't unhinged, he was meticulous, quiet, completely convinced of his own virtue, and that might be the most frightening kind of cruelty, the one that believes it's doing good. You sit now in the cold shadows of a cathedral staring at a stone altar. Somewhere behind the walls you hear weeping, chains rattling, a voice whispering psalms that sound more like curses, and in that moment the incense no longer smells sacred. It smells like cover-up. The air thickens as you step through the crumbling stone gates of a once grand fortress. Your boots scuff dust from the old flagstones, and the silence here is different, expectant. Like the walls themselves are holding their breath. The banners are long gone, the iron portcullis rusted in place, but the legacy, still sharp enough to draw blood. This is Wallachia, deep in 15th century Eastern Europe. Thick forests hem in the valleys, wolves prowl in the dark, and rumors move faster than armies. Here, cruelty is more than a tactic, it's a message, and its most fluent speaker. Vlad III, also known, perhaps unfortunately for your sleep schedule, as Vlad the Impaler. Or if you prefer his more gothic rebrand, Dracula. Vlad wasn't a warlord in the traditional sense. He wasn't building empires like Genghis or crusading for heaven like Torquemada. He was a prince, a man whose reign was defined not by expansion, but by survival. And survival in 15th century Wallachia meant being ruthless in ways that made even the Ottomans pause. Let's get your bearings. Vlad was born in 1431 in Transylvania. Yes, that Transylvania into the house of Draculesti, a branch of the powerful Basarab dynasty. His father, Vlad II Dracul, earned the name Dracul by joining the Order of the Dragon, a knightly group sworn to defend Christianity against the advancing Ottoman Turks. That Dracul title, it means dragon, which makes young Vlad the son of the dragon, or Dracula, not fiction yet, just intense family branding. Now things get messy fast. Vlad and his brother were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court as part of a political please don't invade us agreement. There, Vlad learned Turkish, strategy, and according to some tales, just how to break a man without spilling unnecessary blood. Eventually, he returned to Wallachia and seized the throne, multiple times, because nothing was stable and betrayal was the local dialect. But once he had power, he used it. And now for the meat of it, impalement. Vlad's favorite method of execution involved sharpened stakes, driven into the ground and victims slowly lowered onto them, sometimes inserted rectally, other times through the chest or mouth. The idea wasn't instant death. The stakes were angled deliberately to avoid vital organs, stretching out the agony for hours, sometimes days. Mainstream fact: during one campaign, Vlad reportedly impaled over 20,000 people, so many that the forest outside Targovist was nicknamed the Forest of the Impaled. When an invading Ottoman force entered the area and saw it, they reportedly turned around and fled. No battle needed. The fringe tidbit: some chronicles claim Vlad invited dinner guests and ate surrounded by impaled victims, dipping bread into their blood like soup. Now, this might be propaganda, Or it might be something he let people believe on purpose. Because the more monstrous the rumors, the more fear he wielded like a second sword. You know what's especially jarring? By the standards of the time, Vlad wasn't seen as insane by everyone. In fact, many Romanians see him as a national hero. Why? Because he fought back against the Ottomans, cleaned out corrupt nobles, and enforced law in a region where chaos ruled. He punished thieves. He made roads safer. Sure, the punishment was impalement, but hey, no more pickpockets. There's one folktale about a golden cup left on a public fountain. No one stole it, not because of love, but because they knew what would happen if they did. Historians still argue whether Vlad's cruelty was exceptional or just exceptionally well recorded. Was he worse than others, or just more theatrical? Some scholars point out that many of the most disturbing accounts come from German pamphlets and Ottoman sources, who had a vested interest in making Vlad look like a lunatic. Others argue that Vlad himself wanted to be feared more than loved, and may have encouraged the myth. What's undeniably true is this: his methods worked. He kept Wallachia relatively stable while neighboring regions fell apart. He resisted multiple invasions, and even when he was betrayed, imprisoned, and briefly exiled, he clawed his way back, bloodied, bruised, and probably dragging a stake or two with him. He died predictably on the battlefield. His head was sent to the Sultan of the Ottomans in Constantinople, preserved in honey like some gruesome trophy. But Vlad, he never really disappeared. Centuries later, Bram Stoker would use fragments of his legend to create Count Dracula, the undead noble feeding on blood, hiding in castles, and charming his victims just before the kill. The real Vlad didn't drink blood, probably, but his reputation was vampiric, spreading across Europe, impossible to kill, impossible to ignore. And you're left standing on a foggy hill, just outside the ruins of Ponari Castle. The moonlight catches on a twisted branch, and for a second, it looks like a stake. Sleep tight. You descend from the Carpathians, leaving behind the legends of blood-soaked princes and into a world that seems more refined, more polished. Velvet robes, elaborate court dances, gold-threaded tapestries, but don't be fooled by the embroidery. Because tonight you're in Renaissance Italy and the daggers here are hidden behind smiles. Poison tastes like wine. And cruelty, it's not loud, it's strategic. Enter Cesare Borgia, the most infamous of Italy's power players and the man who inspired Machiavelli himself to write The Prince. You remember that book, the one that says it's better to be feared than loved? Yep, that guy. Let's set the stage. It's the late 15th century, and Italy is less a country and more a violent family reunion gone wrong. Dozens of duchies, city-states, mercenary armies, and corrupt popes all scrambling for power. It's like Game of Thrones if every character had a Latin name and 6 godfathers. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475, the illegitimate son of Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. Yeah, the Pope, not your average church upbringing. Cesare was destined for a career in the church too, because that's what you did with your spare sons when you wanted more power. But Cesare, he had other plans. He swapped his cardinal's robe for armor and started carving out a personal kingdom in central Italy. And by carving, we mean conquering, scheming, and eliminating threats with surgical precision. Unlike Vlad, Cesare didn't need spikes. He had charisma and a chilling willingness to do whatever it took. Mainstream fact: Cesare ruthlessly unified much of Romagna and the Papal States through war, diplomacy, and casual assassination. His military campaigns were admired for their speed and efficiency. Even enemies admitted he was brilliant. But brilliance can be blinding, especially when laced with betrayal. Let's talk poison. Cesare's court allegedly had a man who specialized in toxins, and his favorite method of dealing with rivals was either strangulation or a poisoned banquet. One rival cardinal died mysteriously after dinner. Others were found floating in the Tiber River, bound, gagged, and stabbed with surgical precision. You start to get the sense that Cessair saw the human body not as sacred, but as a tool, and tools can be discarded. There's a particularly dark tale about how Cessair dealt with his own military captains when he suspected they were getting too ambitious. He invited them to a feast, smiled across the table, toasted to their future victories, and then had them murdered before sunrise. Historians still debate how many men died that night. Some say 4, some say dozens. But the message was clear: trust no one. Even Cessair's younger brother, Juan, ended up dead under suspicious circumstances, found floating in the river. Was it Cessair? No one proved it, but let's just say the timing was convenient and Cessair certainly benefited. Family dinners must have been awkward after that. The fringe detail. Cessair was rumored to have commissioned portraits of himself modeled after Christ, blending religious imagery with political domination. Whether true or not, it shows just how untouchable he saw himself. Half saint, half king, all danger. And then there's Machiavelli. The famed Florentine diplomat met Cessair during negotiations and became deeply fascinated. In his book The Prince, Machiavelli uses Cessair as the ideal ruler, cruel when necessary, generous when strategic, always in control. To Machiavelli, Cessair's biggest mistake wasn't being too ruthless. It was not being ruthless enough when it counted most. Because here's the twist: Cessair's rise was dazzling. His grip on power seemed unbreakable. But when his father, Pope Alexander VI, suddenly died, Cessair lost his anchor. And in a world of shifting alliances, that meant open season. Within a year, Cessair's enemies, especially the newly elected Pope Julius II, turned on him. He was arrested, exiled, and stripped of his territories. He escaped, joined a foreign army, and kept trying to fight his way back, but his magic was gone. He died young, killed in battle at just 31, far from his palaces and poisons. His body was found naked, covered in wounds, abandoned by the very mercenaries he once commanded. Historians still argue whether Cessair was a visionary who could have unified Italy or just a monster in velvet. Some paint him as a tragic figure, crushed by politics. Others see him as a man who fed on fear until he finally choked on it. But in the moonlight-lit ruins of his old fortress, you can still feel the tension, like the air is rehearsing one last betrayal. You move quietly past the marble busts and wonder, how many of those smiles were carved by people who died the day after? In Cessair's world, cruelty wasn't a crime. It was policy. The Mediterranean wind shifts, warm and salt-tinged, as you step off the marble docks of Constantinople, now Istanbul. You're just in time for the dawn call to prayer, echoing over domes and minarets. But don't let the beauty fool you. Behind those golden crescents and silk-clad halls, there's a trail of blood slicker than any battlefield. You've now entered the court of Maimed II, also known as Maimed the Conqueror, the man who brought down the Byzantine Empire, crushed Constantinople, and built an empire with cruelty so calculated, it makes previous tyrants look disorganized. But here's the catch: he didn't relish cruelty, he weaponized it. Maimed was born in 1432 into the Ottoman royal family, with his life charted from cradle to coronation. He was a prodigy, fluent in 7 languages, a scholar of math, law, and classical philosophy. His tutors taught him Aristotle alongside the Quran. And yet, they also taught him the coldest lesson of all: only one of you can rule. Because in the Ottoman Empire, succession wasn't decided by votes, seniority, or polite family brunches. It was a race, a brutal, literal race. When the Sultan died, his sons, however many there were, rushed to the capital, and the first to take the throne, he won. The others, well, they didn't get a retirement plan. Mainstream fact: Maimed II legalized fratricide, literally wrote it into law. If you became sultan, you were not only allowed, you were encouraged to kill your brothers. Why? To prevent civil war, to ensure stability. to avoid the empire fracturing into 1,000 screaming shards. So when Maimed ascended the throne in 1451, what did he do? He had his infant brother strangled with a silken bowstring. Yes, infant. Some records say the child was just a few months old. No betrayal, no coup, just potential, and that was enough. Historians still debate whether Maimed felt remorse or if he ever doubted the policy. But one thing's clear, he saw it as necessary. In his own words, "For the welfare of the state, the killing of brothers is acceptable." You feel that chill? That's history, not horror fiction. Of course, his reign wasn't just family purging and political bloodletting. Maimed's greatest and most famous act of ruthlessness came in 1453, when he led a massive army to the gates of Constantinople, the 1,000-year-old jewel of the Christian East. The Byzantine Empire at that point was little more than a single city surrounded by enemies, but it still stood, with its thick walls, iconic mosaics, and deep religious symbolism. People believed it was unbreakable. Maimed broke it in 53 days. He brought cannons the size of buses, including one so massive it took 60 oxen to move. He surrounded the city with fleets, battalions, tunnels, and an endless barrage of siege fire. Eventually, the walls crumbled. The city fell, and so did its people. Fringe detail: Maimed reportedly entered Hagia Sophia, the crown jewel of Byzantine Christianity, still slick with blood and screams echoing outside. He ordered it converted into a mosque immediately. Some say he even wept, not for the victims, but for the fleeting nature of empires. Yet just hours before, he had allowed his troops 3 days of unrestricted plunder, a reward for taking the city. The chaos was unimaginable. Churches were looted, civilians enslaved, art destroyed. One monk wrote that he didn't believe God could forgive such an event. Maimed's cruelty wasn't wild or emotional. It was mechanical, delivered with the precision of an empire builder. And it worked. He went on to expand the Ottoman Empire across 3 continents, reformed the military, established legal systems, and turned Istanbul into a multicultural capital. Jews fleeing persecution in Spain were welcomed. Scholars and poets were funded. Libraries were built. And yet, his enemies called him the Second Alexander. His followers called him the shadow of God on earth. But behind every grand title, there were corpses quietly stacked behind the throne. Historians still argue over how much of his cruelty was necessity and how much was choice. Was he uniquely brutal, or simply the product of a system that rewarded bloodshed masked as policy? Some say Maimed was the ultimate realist, building a world too vast for mercy. And then there's the whispering rumor that never dies, that Maimed left behind secret vaults beneath Topkapi Palace, filled with the records of his executions, the names he erased, and the brothers whose breaths he shortened. No one ever found them. But sometimes, late at night, the archivists say they hear silk dragging across the stone. You don't believe in ghosts, but here, beneath the Ottoman crescents and golden domes, cruelty doesn't need to haunt. It rains. You wander westward now, across the sun-drenched plains of Spain, where the air smells of oranges and incense, and the bells of ancient cathedrals still echo through narrow cobblestone streets. There's a kind of golden haze over everything. Medieval towns nestled under hills, olive groves stretched like green carpets, the scent of roasted lamb wafting from an open hearth. Sounds peaceful, right? Too peaceful. Because here in 15th century Spain, peace isn't something you just have. It's something you enforce. Welcome to the era of the Spanish Inquisition and its most merciless architect, Tomás de Torquemada. Now, before you start imagining Monty Python skits and red robes, let's clear something up. This was not a joke. Torquemada wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a hyper-disciplined, deeply devout Dominican friar who believed with full sincerity that torture saved souls. He didn't hate people, he feared for their afterlives. which arguably makes it worse. Let's rewind. It's the 1470s. Spain has recently unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, the royal couple who will soon bankroll Columbus. But before they go gallivanting across the Atlantic, they have a small matter to deal with: religious unity. Spain for centuries had been a tapestry of Christians, Muslims, and Jews, sometimes at war, sometimes at peace. But now, with a unified Christian crown, there's a new motto in town: one faith, one king. And guess who gets appointed to make that happen? Yup, Torquemada. Mainstream fact. As the first Grand Inquisitor, he personally oversaw the reorganization of the Spanish Inquisition into a nationwide institution of fear, with courts, investigators, informants, and yes, elaborate torture chambers. His targets: anyone suspected of false conversion, especially Jews who had converted to Christianity, called conversos, and might still practice Jewish traditions in secret. It gets murky quickly. Someone lights candles on a Friday night, suspicious. Avoids pork, definitely suspicious. Doesn't show up to Mass every Sunday, highly suspect. The Inquisition didn't need proof, just enough gossip to start an investigation. And once you were in their hands, well, you're not being burned at the stake right away, don't worry. First comes the questioning, and it was very medieval. The rack, water torture, stripado, look that one up tomorrow when it's daylight, all designed to extract confession. Fringe detail. Torquemada had his own system of anonymous tip boxes set up in churches, where people could snitch on their neighbors. No names, no evidence required. Imagine your childhood friend reporting you because your mom hummed a Hebrew tune, or your baker turning you in over a property dispute. And yes, some of these reports were entirely fabricated, just to settle scores. Historians still argue whether Torquemada understood the extent of the corruption his system enabled, or whether he saw it all as God's will working through broken vessels. The burnings were public and had a name: auto da fe. That's Portuguese for act of faith. Picture town squares filled with crowds in Sunday best, banners waving, priests chanting, as those deemed heretics, sometimes dozens at a time, were marched out in tunics painted with flames. The accused didn't always die screaming. Many had already confessed, been imprisoned for years, or starved slowly in dungeons below cities like Seville and Toledo. Others, especially those who refused to confess, were burned alive in the center of the crowd. Here's your reality check. These executions weren't acts of rage, they were choreographed rituals, carefully scripted, meant to be edifying. There's a debate among scholars. Was Torquemada personally present at the burnings? Some say yes. Others argue he avoided the spectacle, preferring to manage the machinery from behind the curtain. Either way, he signed the orders. Lots of them. By the time he died in 1498, conservative estimates place the number of executions under his oversight at over 2,000, with tens of thousands more imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. And that's just the first wave. The Inquisition would continue for centuries after his death. Fringe tidbit: despite the power and terror he wielded, Torquemada reportedly refused all personal luxuries, living simply in black robes, often fasting and sleeping on a wooden bed. In his mind, he was a humble servant of God, not a monster. That's the part that makes your skin crawl, the unwavering sincerity behind the cruelty. Eventually, his name became synonymous with terror, even among fellow clergy. After his death, it was said the wind around his grave carried whispers. Pilgrims passing nearby crossed themselves, not for salvation, but in case the earth ever cracked open. And here's the part that really lingers. Torquemada wasn't an outlier. He was the system. You feel the breeze shift again, and the scent of smoke curls under your nose. Is it just a village oven baking bread? Or something darker, smoldering from memory? In Spain, fire was more than heat. It was judgment. You drift now through the Alps, sharp peaks piercing the clouds like a line of jagged thoughts. The air gets colder, the sky more metallic, and the wind carries something peculiar, not fear exactly, but control. Ruthless, precise, almost surgical. Welcome to 15th century Wallachia, modern-day Romania. Land of forests, fortresses, and a man whose name alone has become legend. Vlad the Impaler. You might know him better as Vlad the Impaler, or Dracula. Now before your imagination turns to fangs and velvet capes, reel it back. This Vlad drinks wine, not blood, but what he does to his enemies. Honestly, blood drinking might be the lesser horror. Vlad was born around 1431 in Transylvania, to a noble family caught in the spinning blades of three great powers: the Hungarian Kingdom, the Ottoman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire. As a child, he and his brother were taken hostage by the Ottomans, essentially raised as political pawns. Mainstream fact: historians agree that this time in captivity shaped his psychology and tactics. He saw cruelty used efficiently by both Turks and Christians, so he decided to get very, very good at it himself. When he came to power in Wallachia in 1456, he inherited a chaotic mess. Bandits roamed freely, boyars, noblemen, plotted constantly, and invasions loomed from every direction. Vlad's solution: absolute fear. One of his first acts was to invite the local nobles to a feast. Charming, right? Until, halfway through dinner, he had them arrested and impaled, or forced on a death march to build his fortress at Ponari. Historians still argue whether this was pure vengeance or a calculated purge to clear out traitors. And yes, impalement. Let's talk about it carefully. This wasn't just execution, it was statement. Vlad's favorite method involved a wooden stake, dull at the end, inserted so the victim wouldn't die quickly. The goal wasn't mercy, it was slow agony, often taking hours, sometimes days. Victims could be arranged in rows, circles, even geometric patterns, left to rot as a warning to others. There's a fringe story, unverified but persistent, that Vlad once impaled 20,000 Ottoman soldiers outside the city of Targovist. When the Sultan's scouts saw it, they turned back in horror. The tactic worked. The Ottomans retreated. Another tale: Vlad reportedly nailed turbans to the skulls of visiting Turkish envoys who refused to remove their head coverings. A lesson in etiquette, Wallachian style. Was he a monster? Maybe. But here's the twist: he was beloved by many of his own people. Crime dropped to nearly zero during his reign. Merchants traveled safely. Borders held. Justice, however twisted, was fast. One apocryphal story says a golden goblet was left on a public fountain in Wallachia, and no one dared steal it. Historians still debate how much of Vlad's legend was real, and how much was exaggerated by his enemies, particularly the Saxon merchants and Hungarian chroniclers who despised him. Many of the most gruesome tales were penned in pamphlets printed with woodcuts that make your darkest dreams look like bedtime cartoons. Still, some of the stories had eerie detail, too much detail. And remember, Vlad lived in a time when brutality wasn't unusual, but his flavor of cruelty, it was personal, operatic, almost artistic. He didn't just win battles, he curated terror. Fringe tidbit: there are accounts of Vlad calmly eating lunch among the impaled, dipping his bread in their blood. Is it propaganda? Could be. But after everything else you've heard, do you doubt he'd enjoy the aesthetic? He ruled on and off, his reign constantly challenged. He died in 1476, either betrayed by his own men or cut down in battle. His head was sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, reportedly preserved in honey. But here's the kicker: his grave is empty. The monastery at Snagov, where he was supposedly buried, has no confirmed remains. No bones, just a stone slab and a question mark. And so, the line between history and myth begins to blur. You've seen cruelty as politics, cruelty as religious zeal, cruelty as strategy. But with Vlad, it was a brand. He understood what modern minds call psychological warfare. Leave behind a trail of stakes, not just to kill, but to haunt, to echo, to spread. Even now, centuries later, people don't forget his name. And neither will you. The road grows fainter now, fading into damp soil and curling fog. You tread softly through pine forests that whisper secrets in Old Norse. The moon peeks through clouds like it's afraid of what lies below. You've reached the edge of Europe and its memory. Welcome to the Scandinavian frontier. Specifically, Sweden, late 17th century. Yes, we're sneaking slightly outside the strict medieval timeline here, but trust me, Karin Persdotter is too dark to leave out. If you thought medieval cruelty belonged to kings, inquisitors, or generals, think again. Sometimes it lived in village women, with steady hands and iron convictions. Because Karin wasn't a warrior or a queen. She was a midwife, a wise woman, and for much of her life, a respected community healer in the forested heartlands of Sweden. That is, until something twisted inside her reputation, and the line between nurturer and executioner blurred completely. Mainstream fact: Karin was one of the most notorious witch prickers during Sweden's infamous witch hunts in the 1660s and 70s. She was both accuser and examiner, tasked with identifying witches, and she did so with terrifying enthusiasm. Her method, you might want to sit down for this. She'd strip the accused, usually a terrified girl or older woman, and search for the devil's mark, a mole, scar, or birthmark believed to be where Satan had kissed them. Then came the needle. She'd stab it in. If the woman didn't bleed or feel pain, well, that was proof she was a witch. Some marks were freckles. Fringe tidbit: Karin sometimes used dull or retractable needles, tools commonly associated with professional frauds. Meaning, the test was rigged and people likely died because of it. Historians still argue whether Karin truly believed what she was doing, or whether she was a cold opportunist cashing in on mass hysteria. Because in this strange chapter of history, witch hunting was not just state-sponsored, it was profitable. Accusers were often paid in coin or goods, and communities rewarded those who purified them. But there was more to Karin than just pinpricks and paranoia. She had a reputation for cruelty, even among other witch hunters. She recommended sleep deprivation, enforced fasting, and repeated questionings, all under the guise of spiritual cleansing. Girls as young as 10 were interrogated under her watch. One particularly disturbing case: Karin oversaw the trial of 7 sisters, aged between 8 and 16. All were accused of flying to Blackula, the Swedish equivalent of a witch's Sabbath. Their testimony was pulled from them under pressure and suggestion, each confession matching the next a little too neatly. Several were executed. Let that sit for a moment. Children, coerced by fear, led to the deaths of other children. And through it all, Karin watched. She wrote meticulous reports. She cross-examined sobbing mothers. She lectured from scripture with calm clarity. It's the quietness of her cruelty that unnerves you. No dramatic speeches, no bonfires or shrieking mobs, just frost-covered ground, a wooden table, and the slow turning of a page. You might think she was alone in this, some isolated fanatic. But the truth: Sweden executed over 300 people for witchcraft in a few short decades, many of them under the authority of people like Karin. And here's the haunting part: she was never punished. Unlike in other European countries where witch hunters were sometimes discredited or tried when hysteria faded, Karin lived out her years in relative peace. She retired with a tidy sum and local prestige. No remorse on record, no apologies, just a vanished trail of victims, many too young to understand what they were accused of. Historians still puzzle over her motivations. Some say she genuinely feared the devil's work in her village. Others suggest deeper psychological threads, grudges, jealousy, even past trauma. But in the end, speculation doesn't change outcomes. What remains is the strange ache of witnessing evil dressed up as duty. Because when violence hides behind the veil of righteousness, it multiplies, quietly, systematically. And perhaps most terrifying of all, sometimes the cruelest person in the room is the one who swears she's saving you. The night has deepened now, cooler and more still. You pass the final torchlit corridor of history, where the stone walls press close, and every footstep seems to echo with centuries of judgment. Your journey has taken you through queens, warlords, popes, and peasants, but we end not with a sword or stake, but with a smile. A smile that never quite reaches the eyes. Meet Gilles de Rais, former knight, national hero, companion in arms to Joan of Arc, and yes, arguably one of the most chilling figures in late medieval Europe. He was born around 1405 into one of the wealthiest families in France. By his teenage years, he had already tasted battle, commanded men, and by all accounts radiated charisma. He rode alongside Joan during some of her most decisive victories, including the Siege of Orleans. The French court loved him. The church praised him. He had everything. Mainstream fact: when Joan was captured and burned at the stake in 1431, Gilles was reportedly shattered. Not long after, he withdrew from military life, and his path took a steep, disturbing turn. He turned instead to theatrical pageantry, alchemy, and occultism. He built elaborate stage productions. Some said entire castles were transformed into temporary theaters for his private plays. He poured wealth into alchemists who promised gold, eternal youth, or communion with the devil himself. And then children began to disappear. At first it was only whispers, servants' sons, peasant boys who never came home. Then dozens, then more. Gilles de Rais, once a savior of France, was now accused of abducting, torturing, and murdering over 100 children. The confessions, taken under the weight of interrogation and fear, are grim. Witnesses described secret rooms, rituals, and nightly acts of unspeakable cruelty. He allegedly confessed to satanic summoning ceremonies, even staging mock masses in which the murdered were part of the offering. Fringe detail: some reports claimed he used parts of the children's bodies in alchemical experiments, trying to transmute soul and flesh into something divine or immortal. Historians still argue whether these more occult aspects were exaggerations, perhaps twisted by the church to make his crimes seem even more diabolical. But the body count alone defies rationalization. Gilles was arrested in 1440, tried in both secular and ecclesiastical courts, and, after a theatrical public confession, was hanged and burned. Now here's the uncomfortable wrinkle. Some modern scholars argue he might have been the victim of a political frame-up, targeted because of his immense wealth and eccentric behavior. They point to forged documents, inconsistent testimonies, and the church's eagerness to seize his estates. Still, the sheer number of missing children and the alignment between confessions and witness accounts make this revisionist view hard to fully embrace. It's one of those rare cases where the truth might actually be worse than the myth. And here's the twisted tragedy. Gilles died asking for forgiveness, his voice trembling with faith and fear. He even requested to be buried in a church. Crowds wept at his execution, not just in horror, but because they still remembered the dazzling knight who had once fought for France. In him you see the perfect mirror of cruelty, not born from rage or vengeance or even fanaticism, but from boredom, arrogance, and a slow descent into darkness unchecked by accountability. Which brings you here, to the final whisper of this journey. You've walked beside emperors who melted gold down throats, queens who flayed conspirators alive, clerics who turned mercy into torture, knights who built towers of bones, and ordinary folk, school teachers, midwives, neighbors, who betrayed their own under the guise of law, custom, or God. You've learned that cruelty doesn't always roar. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it prays. Sometimes it organizes meetings and passes laws, and sometimes it quietly believes itself righteous, which might be the scariest part of all. And now, let's ease away from that last image. Castle gates swinging shut behind us, the fog rolling in, muffling the horror like snow. It's time to slow things down and let the weight of the past settle gently. So here you are, safe and sound, at the quiet edge of a long and heavy road. The torchlight of cruelty has dimmed, and the footsteps of tyrants, inquisitors, and broken souls grow fainter behind you. Take a moment now, let your shoulders drop, breathe in long and deep. The past has teeth, but tonight you've walked through it and made it out the other side. You've seen how people, flawed and frightened and powerful, shaped a world not so different from ours. Different tools, same hunger. Different costumes, same shadows. And you listened, you imagined, you understood. The important thing to remember is this. History doesn't repeat because we forget. It repeats because we pretend it can't happen again. But by facing it, even in the dark, even by candlelight, you've taken the first step toward keeping those echoes from growing louder. Let the noise of battle now fade to whispers. Let the clinking chains dissolve into mist. Let the iron smell of fear be replaced by something softer, lavender maybe, or wood smoke, something warm. Let the silence stretch a little more. The night is yours now. Rest well, sleep deep, and if dreams come, may they be gentle. Sweet dreams.